You are standing in a narrow pass between a towering cliff and the cold blue sea. Behind you is all of Greece. In front of you, filling the entire plain and stretching back beyond the horizon, is the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled. You can hear it long before you can see the end of it. A low rumble of hooves, wheels, and hundreds of thousands of marching feet. The dust they raise climbs into the sky and blots out the sun. The sea to your right is black with warships, so many that the water itself seems to have vanished beneath their hulls. Beside you stand a few thousand men. Behind that enemy tide stand perhaps 250,000. You are a Greek soldier at a place called Thermopylae in the late summer of 480 BC, and you have been sent here not to win, but to die well enough to save your homeland. Almost everyone has heard the story of the 300 Spartans. But the version most people know is a myth stacked on top of a legend, polished by 2,500 years of retelling until the hard edges of the truth have worn smooth. The real story is stranger, harder, and far more interesting than any movie. There were not only 300 men, they were not alone, and their glorious last stand was made possible by an act of betrayal that almost no one remembers. So let us strip away the paint and stand in that pass as it really was, on the day the world seemed to end. Why would a few thousand men march willingly into a battle they were almost certain to lose? To understand that, you first have to understand who was coming for them, and why the fate of the entire Western world seemed to hang on a strip of rock barely wide enough for a wagon. The man leading that endless army was Xerxes, the king of kings, ruler of the Persian Empire. His empire was the greatest the world had yet seen, stretching from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains bordering India, swallowing dozens of nations and tongues under a single crown. His father Darius had tried to conquer Greece a decade earlier and been humiliated on the plain of Marathon, where a smaller Athenian force sent the Persians fleeing back to their ships. That defeat was a stain on the empire's honor, and Xerxes had spent years preparing to wipe it away. He gathered soldiers from every corner of his realm, Persians and Medes, Assyrians and Bactrians, Indians and Ethiopians, Egyptians and Arabs, each in their own armor, each speaking their own language, all marching under his banner. Ancient writers claimed the host numbered in the millions. Modern historians believe the real figure was somewhere between 70,000 and 300,000 fighting men, still an almost unimaginable force for the age. To move it, Xerxes did things that sounded like the boasts of a god. He bridged an entire sea, lashing hundreds of boats together so his army could walk from Asia into Europe. He dug a canal straight through the base of a mountain so his fleet could avoid a dangerous cape. How do a handful of small, quarreling Greek city-states stand against a power that can reshape the earth itself? For most of their history, the Greeks did not stand together at all. This is the first thing you have to understand about them. They were not a nation. They were dozens of fiercely independent cities, each with its own government, its own gods, its own pride, and very often its own grudges against the city next door. Athens and Sparta were rivals. Thebes leaned toward the Persians. Many cities, seeing the size of the coming storm, simply sent Xerxes gifts of earth and water, the traditional signs of surrender, and prayed to be spared. The idea of a united Greece was almost a fantasy. And yet the sheer terror of Xerxes managed to do what centuries of shared language and religion never had. It forced a fragile alliance. A league of Greek cities agreed to resist, and they agreed on where to make their stand. Not on an open plain, where the Persian numbers and cavalry would crush them, but at a place where the land itself would fight on their side. That place was Thermopylae. The name means the hot gates, for the warm sulfur springs that steamed and stank along the shore. Here the mountains of central Greece came down almost to the water and left only a slender strip of passable ground between the cliffs and the sea. At its narrowest, the road shrank to a width where a single wagon could barely pass, and an old defensive wall built by the local people still stood across it. This was the doorway to southern Greece. To reach Athens, to reach Sparta, to reach the heart of the Greek world, Xerxes' vast army had to squeeze through this bottleneck. And in that bottleneck, all his overwhelming numbers would count for almost nothing. He could not send 100,000 men forward at once. He could only send as many as could fit shoulder to shoulder in a gap a few dozen meters wide. It was, quite literally, the perfect place for the few to hold back the many. Can you see now why a small army would choose to die here rather than anywhere else? Here, and perhaps only here, the impossible became merely desperate. command of the Greek force fell to a Spartan king named Leonidas, and here is the first great correction to the legend. He did not have 300 men. He led a combined Greek army of around 7,000, drawn from many cities: Thespians and Thebans, Arcadians and Corinthians, men from Mycenae and Phlius and beyond, all marching under a Spartan king, because Sparta's soldiers were the most feared in all of Greece. The famous 300 were the elite royal bodyguard that Leonidas personally brought from Sparta. But those 300 were something the world had never seen before, because Sparta was not really a city in the way Athens was. It was a machine built for one purpose: to make warriors. From the age of 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his mother and thrown into a brutal state training system called the agoge. He was underfed on purpose and encouraged to steal food to survive, then beaten if he was caught, not for stealing, but for being caught. He was toughened against cold, pain, and fear. He was taught that the highest honor a man could earn was to die in the front line for Sparta, and that the deepest disgrace was to throw away his shield and run. Spartan mothers, the legend says, told their sons going to war to come back with their shield or on it, carried home dead upon it, or not at all. These men owned no trade and did no farming. That work was done by a vast population of enslaved people called Helots, whose labor freed every Spartan man to train for war his entire life. Can you imagine being raised from your 7th birthday for the single purpose of standing your ground at the exact moment every instinct in your body is screaming at you to flee? That is what Xerxes' soldiers were about to walk into. There is a story that captures the Spartan spirit better than any speech. As the two armies faced off across the pass, Xerxes sent an envoy forward with a simple demand: lay down your weapons. Leonidas is said to have answered with 2 words that have echoed for 25 centuries: Molon lab, come and take them. When another Persian tried to frighten the Greeks by boasting that his army's arrows were so numerous they would blot out the sun, a Spartan named Leonidas reportedly shrugged and said, so much the better, then we shall fight in the shade. This was not bravado for its own sake. These men had made their peace with death before the battle ever began. A soldier who has already accepted that he will die is a soldier who cannot be broken by fear. And that made the men of Thermopylae the most dangerous thing on any battlefield. Not the strongest, not the most numerous, but the least afraid. Then the fighting began. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, waited 4 days, certain the tiny Greek force would lose its nerve and melt away when it saw the true size of his army. When they did not, he grew angry and sent his infantry forward to teach these insolent men a lesson. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers poured into the narrow gap, and wave after wave was cut down. The Greeks fought in a formation called the Phalanx, and to understand the battle you have to picture it clearly. Imagine a wall of men standing shoulder to shoulder, each carrying a large round shield on his left arm. Each man's shield covered not only his own body, but the exposed right side of the man beside him, so that the whole line locked together into a single unbroken wall of bronze. Out of the front of that wall bristled a hedge of long spears, rank upon rank, so that an attacker faced not one point, but many before he could even reach the shields. The Greeks were armored in bronze, from helmet to greaves. Many of the Persian infantry wore cloth and wicker shields, weapons built for a different kind of war. In the open field, Persian cavalry and archers were deadly, but here, funneled into a stone corridor with cliffs on one side and sea on the other, none of that mattered. There was no room to flank, no room to maneuver, no room to bring numbers to bear. The Persians could only come straight on, a few dozen at a time, into the spears. And they died in heaps. The Spartans even turned the enemy's numbers into a trap. They would sometimes wheel about and pretend to flee in panic. The Persians, seeing the feared Spartans running, would break their ranks and charge forward, howling in triumph, sure the enemy had finally cracked. Then, at the last instant, the Spartans would turn as one, lock their shields, and slaughter the disordered mob that had chased them. The bodies piled up so high that the Persians had to climb over their own dead to keep fighting. Herodotus tells us that Xerxes, watching from his throne on the hillside, 3 times leapt to his feet in fear for his army. Think about that. The most powerful man on earth, master of 100 nations, watching in horror as his glittering host shattered itself against a few thousand men in a doorway of rock. How could this be? How could the whole weight of the world be stopped by a wall of shields? On the second day, Xerxes played his greatest card. He sent in the Immortals. This was his personal bodyguard, 10,000 elite soldiers, the finest in the entire empire, and they carried a name designed to terrify. Whenever one of them fell, whether killed or merely wounded, another man instantly stepped into his place, so that the unit's number never dropped, and it seemed to the enemy as if these soldiers could not die at all. Surely, Xerxes thought, these champions could accomplish what the common troops could not. But the Immortals marched into the hot gates and met exactly the same fate as everyone before them. The past did not care how elite you were. It only cared how many of you could fit through it at once, and the answer was always too few. The greatest soldiers in the empire died on the same Greek spears as the rest. For 2 entire days, the mightiest army the world had ever seen threw its full fury at the narrow pass. And for 2 entire days, a few thousand Greeks held the line and would not yield a single step. By the end of the second day, Xerxes was no longer angry. He was afraid. His army was bleeding to death against a wall it could not break by force. The answer, in the end, was not force. It was treachery. And this is the part of the story the legend almost always forgets. There lived in that region a local Greek man named Ephialtes. Hoping for a rich reward from the Persian king, he crept into Xerxes' camp and betrayed a secret that would doom the defenders. There was a hidden path. It wound up through the forested mountains, over the heights, and came down again behind the Greek position in the pass. The entire strategy of Thermopylae rested on one fact, that the narrow coastal road was the only way through. If the Persians could get around the mountain and come down behind the Greeks, then the trap the Greeks had set would close on them instead. Leonidas was no fool. He had known about the mountain path from the beginning, and he had posted a force of around 1,000 local Phocian soldiers up in the hills to guard it. But when the Immortals came marching up through the trees in the black hours before dawn, the Phocians were caught completely by surprise. They scrambled up the slope to form a battle line, thinking they were the target. The Persians, not wanting to waste time fighting them, simply fired a volley of arrows to pin them down, and then marched on past, leaving the stunned Phocians behind and pressing on toward the pass. The back door of Greece had been thrown open. At dawn on the third day, Leonidas learned the terrible news. The enemy was coming around behind him. The Immortals would soon block the far end of the pass, and the Greek force would be surrounded and destroyed from both sides. Now he faced the hardest decision a commander can make. The position was lost. There was no version of the day that ended in victory. To stay was to die, and so he made a choice that would echo down through every century since. He called a council, and he dismissed the bulk of the Greek army. Thousands of allied soldiers were ordered to fall back, to retreat and live, to carry their strength home so it could be spent on a day when it might actually turn the war. But Leonidas himself and his 300 Spartans would stay. Spartan law and Spartan honor forbade them from ever abandoning their post in battle, whatever the cost. With them, of their own free will, remained around 700 Thespians, who flatly refused to leave their king and chose to die beside him rather than save themselves. A force of Thebans stayed as well. Together, this rear guard of perhaps 1,400 men would hold the pass to the very last, buying with their lives the time the retreating army and the whole Greek cause needed to survive. Would you have stayed? Knowing beyond any doubt that the day ended in your death, knowing that leaving was permitted and no one would call you a coward for it, would you have planted your feet in that pass and turned to face 250,000 men? The final stand was a battle without hope and without surrender, and it burned itself into human memory forever. Leonidas did not wait in the narrow neck of the pass this time. Knowing they were all going to die, he led his men forward into the wider ground, out toward the open where the Persian host waited, so they could kill as many of the enemy as possible before the end. The fighting was savage beyond anything the war had seen. They fought with their long spears until the spears shattered against Persian armor. Then they drew their short swords and fought on. And when the swords broke or were torn from their hands, Herodotus tells us, they fought with their fists and their teeth, wild men refusing to fall. Leonidas himself was struck down early in this last battle, and over his body, a furious struggle erupted. The Spartans, refusing to let their king's corpse fall into enemy hands, drove the Persians back not once but 4 separate times, dragging his body behind their lines each time the tide surged. At last, exhausted and torn, the final survivors fell back onto a small hillock in the pass and formed a tight ring. The Persians, having learned at terrible cost what it meant to close with these men hand to hand, did not want to finish the job with swords. Instead, they surrounded the little hill, drew back, and buried the last defenders under a storm of arrows and stones until nothing on that mound still moved. And so, at last, the men of Thermopylae fought in the shade. Now here is the counterintuitive truth at the heart of this story, the thing that makes it more than just a brave defeat. The Greeks lost. Let us be clear about that. The pass fell. Ephialtes' path had done its work, and the rear guard was annihilated to the last man. Xerxes marched his army south, unopposed, and burned the great city of Athens to the ground, its temples on the sacred hill left as smoking ruins. By every measure of the battlefield, Thermopylae was a defeat. So why, 25 centuries later, do we still tell it as one of the greatest stands in all of human history? Because the 300 and their companions did not die to win a battle. They died to buy two things far more precious than a strip of ground. The first was time, their 3 days of defiance, and the naval battle their fleet was fighting at the same moment at nearby Artemisium, delayed the invasion and let the other Greek cities scramble to prepare, to gather ships, to ready their armies for the fight to come. The second thing they bought was worth even more, an idea. The men of Thermopylae proved, in front of the whole Greek world, that the King of Kings could be resisted, that his soldiers, however numberless, could be made to bleed and die, that free men fighting for their own homes and their own laws were worth more than any host of subjects driven forward under the whip. That idea did not die on the hillock in the pass. It caught fire across Greece. Just weeks after Thermopylae fell, the Greek navy lured the massive Persian fleet into the narrow strait of Salamis, where once again the enemy's numbers became a curse rather than a blessing. And there the Greeks shattered Xerxes' navy so badly that the king himself fled back to Asia in fear of being trapped. The following year, in 479 BC, a united Greek army, with the Spartans at its heart, met the remaining Persian forces on the plain of Plataea and crushed them completely, driving the invaders out of Greece for good, the invasion that had seemed as unstoppable as the tide had been broken. And every Greek who fought at Salamis and Plataea carried with him the memory of what the men at the Hot Gates had done, and the proof they had given that this enemy could be beaten. The Greeks buried their dead where they had fallen, on the very ground they had refused to yield. Over them they raised a simple stone, and on it they carved a few words written by the poet Simonides. They are among the most famous words ever cut into stone. Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie. Read them again, and notice what is not there. There is no boast, no talk of glory, no cry of triumph, no curse upon the enemy, just a quiet message to be carried home. They were told to hold the pass, and they held it, obedient to their laws, until there was no breath left to hold it with. Nearly everything we know of that battle reaches us across the ages through the pages of one man, Herodotus, a Greek writer often called the father of history, who gathered the accounts of survivors and eyewitnesses just a single generation later and wrote them down so they would not be lost. And through his words, across 2,500 years, the men of the Hot Gates are speaking to you right now. You are standing in a narrow pass between a towering cliff and the cold blue sea, the largest army the ancient world has ever assembled marching straight toward you, its dust blotting out the sun. Word has just come down the line that the mountain path is lost, that the enemy is closing behind you, that everything is finished. You have been told you may leave. You have been told the position cannot be held, and that no one alive would blame you for saving your own life while there is still time. And yet you tighten your grip on your shield, feel it lock against the shield of the man beside you, take your place in the line, and turn to face the endless host. You will not live to see the sun set on this day. You will never know that within a year your countrymen will drive this enemy from Greek soil forever. But because you plant your feet in this pass and refuse to run, the idea of a free people who will not kneel does not die here with you. It marches on, long after the last arrow has fallen and the last shield has splintered, out of this narrow pass and into the memory of the world, where it still stands, unbroken, to this very day.